We appreciate the Trump administration facilitating this literally in the last minute, and we're grateful. We listened, we communicated, and we look forward to further conversations.
Who did you speak with exactly?
I'd rather not disclose that. High-ranking Trump administration.
That was Ontario Premier Doug Ford as he emerged from meeting with some members of the Trump administration. He's part of a delegation that continues to press politicians south of the border, hoping to avoid those punishing tariffs. The Team Canada mission has seen provincial leaders in and out of meetings over the last 24 hours. And one of those was with James Blair, the Deputy Chief of Staff for Legislative, Political and Public Affairs in the White House. Here, though, is a reminder of the timeline that Canada is now facing. March 4th, that's where the pause on those so-called border tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods will end. We could see 25% tariffs on most goods, except for energy products, of course, which would face just a 10% tariff. Then there's March the 12th. 25% tariffs on all steel and aluminum imports into the U.S. await Canada and everyone else. What we've learned, though, is that the U.S. would stack those tariffs on top of the other 25% tariffs, meaning Canadian steel and aluminum could face a tariff of 50%. Plus, we've got April 4th. That's the deadline for a U.S. trade deficit review ordered by Donald Trump, which could, of course, result in either further tariffs or a decision one way or the other. At the same time, though, we've got Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He was in Brussels meeting with European leaders, talking about deepening trade ties with the U.S. or with others as the U.S. looks inwards. So it's too early to say if these trips have been successful, but what does a win look like? Let's ask the front bench. Sabrina Grover was a federal Liberal candidate in the 2021 election. She's a senior advisor at Spark Advocacy and North Star Public Affairs. Jamie Ellerton is a conservative strategist and the founding partner of Conapicus Limited. Excuse me for mispronouncing that, Jamie. I knew that I would. And former interim NDP director of the NDP, Carl Boulanger. He's here. He's the president of Traxion Strategies. Thank you all for being here. Sabrina, start with you on this one. What do you think a win looks like? And do you think that they've emerged from this meeting, not to say on top, but certainly in a better position, now understanding a little bit better what the Trump administration wants?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly every time our premiers engage in the United States, whether it's with the White House or with their respective counterparts at the state level, it's a win for us because it helps us get our point across to more than one person, and that person can't just be Donald Trump, right? I think at the end of the day, I still maintain that the administration led by Donald Trump is not a rational actor for us to be dealing with. And so whatever we might have heard from the Deputy Chief of Staff or from other White House staff may not be reflected in what we hear tomorrow in a White House press conference. And so I think it's important for us to be vigilant about that. And I think that's what you're seeing the premiers do. But at the end of the day, you know, it's important for the United States to really understand how these tariffs affect them and Americans directly. You know, I was looking up some stats earlier today, checking back to when these tariffs were first announced in Trump's first administration. And we saw significant job losses in key U.S. states like Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Indiana, that came as a result before COVID. You're seeing like tens of thousands, in Michigan up to 60,000 jobs that came as a loss of because of tariffs. And so reminding Americans that their own jobs are on the line at the state-to-state level, I think is really important. I think the premiers are doing a great job here.
Canaptis, Jamie, Canaptis. And I
there
knew that
you go,
I would eventually
Mike.
get it. Thank you. I know. Thank you for your patience with me.
I believe you.
So when you hear Kirsten Hillman, the U.S. ambassador, or the Canadian ambassador to the U.S., say that Americans already know what we feel about this whole thing around the 51st state. And she had said we didn't have to go in there and pound the table with that. Do you think that that is evidence that the Canadian message is getting through, to Sabrina's point, that they are understanding that, hey, wait a second, this could actually affect us in a negative way?
I wouldn't say I'm quite as optimistic about that. I think what it means is that people around President Trump actually have more common courtesy and just very basic human decency, and aren't looking to be quite as bombastic and inflammatory when meeting with Canadian officials as the president himself is looking to be. I think it was actually quite something. I think it was the CBC's Kate McKenna asked the question, confirming that effectively a lobbying agency was the one that got the premiers this meeting. And I wonder how many hundreds of bureaucrats and diplomats do we have working at the embassy there that we still have to outsource this to consultants to get the meeting. I think it kind of speaks to how flat-footed Canada's been caught and just how dire and precarious our situation is.
Carl, what do you think of the effort and whether or not they can continue this and potentially actually avoid these tariffs?
I mean, part of the problem is that they are basically just starting this. I mean, Premier Legault, for example, it's his first time in 5 years that he's been in Washington.
Right.
So, what kind of a network do you have if it's the first time you go? Because there's a big crisis, and that's part of the problem. So there's a smell of desperation, which is why you have some incoherent messaging coming from the premiers here and there. It's not always in line with the federal government, and in fact, the federal government, wasn't there today. I mean, certainly the Prime Minister wasn't there. And
Dominic LeBlanc, the finance minister.
Sure, fine. And they were meeting with the president's deputy janitor,
You're not impressed,
fine.
clearly.
No, it's fine. It's the bon cop, bad cop strategy, right? Okay, we'll get you a meeting. There, be nice, and then you don't go nuts in the media. You feel positive. You feel optimistic. See, it's not that bad. So I'm not convinced by any of this.
Yeah, and Sabrina, when we heard all of the premiers emerge, I mean, Judy Trinh had mentioned that David Eby didn't really seem as upbeat as maybe some of the other premiers. Do you think that there was a bit of a cooling effect that maybe some of them are walking away going, okay, wait a second, these tariffs are coming?
Yeah, I mean, I push back a little bit on Carl saying that we were flat-footed. I think that both premiers and the federal government have been engaging in the United States for years, including with business organizations, including through trade councils. At the end of the day, when you are dealing with an irrational actor, you can't predict what every day is going to look like. I mean, we didn't know that last week he said he was going to take over Gaza. Like, every day is a unique day in the United States right now, right? So I think that the governments, like provincial and federal, are doing the best that they can. And I think directly speaking to American consumers, business councils is the right way to go. It's the only way to go, in fact. And what I've heard from other, companies who have relationships in the United States is that Americans are upset about these tariffs. And just because we don't hear about it on CNN because we're so focused on Donald Trump doesn't mean that message isn't getting through. So I think it is up to us to continue to negotiate, but also to continue to strengthen our internal trade, break down our internal trade barriers as much as we can and continue to build our relationships with other countries, including in Europe, as the PM is doing.
Yeah, and Jamie, depending on the schedule that you're going on, we've got about a month to either try and convince the Trump administration or hope and brace for whatever comes. Do you think that that's enough time for either more of these visits or more of that outreach that Sabrina's talking about that's necessary?
Well, I definitely think Sabrina's got a point in that it's going to have to be a lot of these things going forward simultaneously, and there's not going to be a silver bullet that resolves this. But I think when you listen to what President Trump is saying and just how hellbent he seems on driving this, I think yet again, he's going to take this deadline all the way to the brink, see what he can get from it, and maybe pull something back while only having half measures introduced. I think it's impossible to handicap what this is doing, and I think the diversity of what you heard coming from the premiers coming out of this speak to their own respective political realities. Premier Eby was just reelected with a majority government and can probably be a little cooler in his head in terms of the message he's taking back as they kind of take a wait and see and look at what other measures they can actually act upon, including cracking down on fentanyl in the province of British Columbia. Whereas Premier Ford is going to talk optimistically because he's in the midst of an election campaign and has staked his whole campaign on it. And so there's a bit of a kabuki theater going on here in trying to sell something to the audience. And in many ways, this kind of feels like a really sad version of In the Loop, CanCon taxpayer subsidized version.
Yeah, to that point, Carl, do you think that he is now, Doug Ford, in a weakened position in the election? Did he put too much on this meeting hoping that he can come home with a win?
Well, I think as long as the tariffs are a threat and he's the guy who's standing up to Donald Trump, he has a good card there to play in the election. The polls certainly are showing that, there's been not that much movement against Donald Trump, against Doug Ford. Right. So we'll see if that lasts. Of course, if there's no results by election time, it may backfire on him that he put all his eggs in that basket.
Yeah, and Yeah, and Sabrina, it's interesting considering that they still have this amount of time. They're still trying to figure out whether or not they can do something about this. And it's really sort of curious as to know whether or not, the prime minister picking up the phone, because he was asked about it today, what are you doing to try and have a meeting with Donald Trump to get this, to force an off-ramp here? Do you think that the prime minister injecting himself into the conversation and going to D.C. would help at all here?
I think certainly that the prime minister should never take that off the table, right? As much as you can get in front of your counterparts at the United States, you have to. But at the end of the day, I don't think that Donald Trump has a singular motivation for the tariffs. I think when we consider the original tariffs with the 25 and 10% compared to the steel tariffs, like you've got a really different motivation. The steel tariffs are much more economic driven. Considering like where the impact would be. But there's also a misunderstanding about how those tariffs might come into effect and what that actually means for workers in the United States. A lot of the job losses that the Americans have seen in steel is not due to a trade deficit with Canada. It's due to automation. And so when we start to see those Americans be hurt by these tariffs, and you start to see increased job losses, and you start to see that narrative seen in the United States where people are like, well, why are the price of my eggs still too expensive? That's when I think Donald Trump's motivations are going to change, and that's not something that Canada can reinforce on its own.
So, Jamie, I guess the question is also, would Trudeau going down there as the outgoing prime minister actually help or harm the conversation here?
I'm skeptical that Prime Minister Trudeau's in a position to actually help this conversation. It appears that President Trump has actually gotten a lot of joy in a Schadenfreude kind of way of poking the Prime Minister and making him appear weak. He essentially has no real mandate to go down there and negotiate on behalf of Canadians. The fact that we have to send 13 or 11 premiers, however many of them are down there today, to try and cobble together this meeting, as Carlson said, with like the deputy whatever of whatever in the White House, so they could check a box and say they got the photo in the meeting, I think speaks to how sad and precarious Canada's space is right now. The fact that you have the Prime Minister kind of trying to lead stuff while clearly not really doing anything, we have no real line of sight as to what's changing, what the realities of these tariffs are going to be, I think speaks to the whole ineffectiveness of how rudderless our federal government is right now, which is why I think you're going to continue to hear opposition parties in Ottawa call for an election, call for real leadership, and to not have Parliament be closed in the midst of this genuine national crisis.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it right there. Jamie Ellerton, Carl Boulanger, and Sabrina Grover, thanks so much for being with us.